Since there's so many different people and things happening in this, plus the colonies, which we'll get to Tuesday, I thought maybe I'd better go over the word list with you real quick. Since this is going to be a real short little thing, if you want to print out your word list and write down what I'm telling you, it will come in handy. Tudor and Stuart dynasties. Henry VIII was the second king of the Tudor dynasty. We need to remember him because he's the one who desperately needed a male heir and he couldn't get a divorce from the Catholic Church. So he left the Catholic Church and started his own church. It's called either the Anglican Church or the Church of England. Either way is fine. Bloody Mary, it was his oldest daughter. When he died and she became queen, she was called Bloody Mary because she was determined to make the England countryside and back into being a Catholic. And if you didn't want to convert to Catholicism, she just simply had you burned at the stake. The people who wanted to leave did, and down here I've got Mary. This probably should have been under Bloody Mary. Marian exiles, that's what they were called because they left under Queen Mary. If they could afford to or could escape it any way they could, they were Protestant and they left England to go somewhere else so she wouldn't kill them. She died childless. Her sister Elizabeth became queen. But Elizabeth was a Protestant, so she made England a very Protestant nation. She wore the symbol of the unicorn on her as a symbol of virginity. She never married, never had any children. Under Elizabeth, England flourished. We began colonies in the New World. Shakespeare was writing. There was all kinds of good stuff going on, plus a war with Spain, which England won. When she died, she had no children, so she named her cousin James VI of Scotland to be James I of England. But now with Elizabeth gone, this ends the Tudor dynasty and starts what we call the Stuart dynasty. James I is the one who commissioned the King James Version of the Bible. He lived many years. I told you some cute stories about him, but you don't need to know that for the test or quiz, either one. But under him, of course, we had Jamestown settled. He didn't go to war, but he was very much a king. Under him, the people who were the Marian exiles came back. But when they came back, they were no longer Marian exiles. They were now Puritans because they wanted to purify the Church of England and get rid of all the Catholicism that they had in there. When James I died, his son, Charles I, became king. And Charles I was not a good king. He was always raising taxes without permission of Parliament. He made friends. He just was not a good king. So the royals around him, as well as some of the townspeople and the city folks, they decided that they'd had enough of this. So there was a little war led by some of the royals and a gentleman named Oliver Cromwell, which was a huge farmer. They won the war and they arrested and tried James I for heresy, not heresy, but for treason, and had him executed. Charles I is the only king of England that was ever executed. When he died, Oliver Cromwell went back to his farm, but then when he looked at London, and London hadn't changed the way they were doing things, so he marched on London with his army and took over as a dictator, and he ruled for 15 years. And he did a pretty good job. He kept peace, he lowered the taxes, he lowered some of the excise taxes, he allowed trade between other countries that England hadn't done before, he released people from prison, he insisted on education, and he was determined to make Great Britain the most puritanical nation in the world. But when he died, his son tried to take over, and his son was not the leader that his dad was. And people around him decided, we're the only country in the world that doesn't have a king. We need to see about getting a king. So they went over to France, where Charles I's children had gone, and talked to Charles II. And he agreed to come over and give up some of the rules that the king had had, but he ruled peacefully for 25 years. He decided he wasn't going to make any waves. He let Parliament do pretty much what they wanted to. But when he died, he had no children. So they contacted his brother, James II, who was still living in France. And he was very, very Catholic. And his second wife was Catholic. His first wife was Protestant, but she had died. So he married again and married a Catholic girl. And when he did come to England, he came with a hatred for Parliament and for England. And he did everything he could to disrupt things. He brought over priests. He just one way after the other. And a little story I didn't mention to you in class because of a short time, but James II had a French wife, and they were both in their 50s when he took over the throne, and really beyond childbearing age. But one morning, people came to the palace, and all of a sudden, the queen has a baby. And she said she hadn't told anyone she was pregnant because she didn't know she could carry it. But the strange thing was, nobody thought she was pregnant. Nobody had witnessed the birth, and there was no blood on any sheets anywhere. Nobody knew anything about this baby. So he got the nickname the bedpan baby, because they used to have this big, long bedpan metal thing with a long handle on it, and they put coals in it and rub it over the sheets to warm the sheets. And the theory was that they brought a baby in this and slid it under the sheets to the queen. Well, everybody knew that if a child wasn't legitimate, but you're going to argue with a king who has the power to cut off your head? No. But Parliament and the royals around got thinking, we can't have this anymore. I mean, he's doing everything he can to disrupt the country. He's Catholic. And even though we know that baby's not his, it looks like we're going to have a Catholic king when he dies. We need to do something. So they went back and contacted James II's children by his first wife, who was Protestant. And Mary was her name, but she was married to the Duke of Orange in France and offered her the throne. Well, she said she'd accept it if her husband could come, and they said yes. So they brought them over, but they had no children. So when they die, Mary dies first, and then William dies shortly thereafter from a fall from a horse. And then Mary's sister, Anne, who didn't have any children, became queen for a while. And then when she died, there's no more Stuarts. The Stuart line is ended. So now we've got to go all the way to Germany to pick up the bloodline, and we start with our Georges. And although George III is king when we have our revolution in the United States. We'll learn more about him when we get to the revolution. So we've got some dissenters. Everybody wasn't happy with the colonies. Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams were both names you need to be familiar with. Anne Hutchinson was a very educated woman, educated beyond her station in life, and also beyond anything anybody knew. I mean, she was just a really talkative woman, but she was also a mother, then married, and she had about 6 kids and was pregnant with the third one. Or not the third one, but the 7th one. She started holding meetings in her home discussing church matters, because women couldn't discuss matters in church. And there got to be more people coming to her home than were going to church. And she was also dressing above her station, financial station. So the powers that be were very unhappy with her. Her followers got to be so great that they actually voted John Winthrop out of the governorship and her friends in. But then they got together and Winthrop was back in. And as soon as he got back in as governor, he arrested her and tried her for heresy. But like I said, she was pregnant, 7 months, well, I'm not following. She was pretty good size with her 7th child, and she defended herself beautifully. No matter what they threw at her, she had an answer for it because she knew the Bible. So they're just about at their wits' end, and they don't know what they're going to do now, and they ask her a question, and she screwed up. How do you know all this stuff? And she says, because God spoke to me. Well, everyone knew that God did not speak to women. So they convicted her of heresy, and they banished her from town. She went south, and then she went a little bit west, and within about 3 years, she and her family were wiped out by Indians, which research has proven that those Indians were hired by somebody in Boston. Roger Williams was another dissenter. He was a registered minister of the Puritan faith, and he had the audacity to suggest that they separate church and civil matters, separation of church and state. Wow. Give women some rights. And oh, by the way, you need to buy the land from the Indians. Well, they banished him, and he went south and set up a colony. It's going to be called Rhode Island. So John Winthrop was the 30-plus years governor of the Plymouth Bay. No, I'm sorry, Massachusetts Bay. William Bradford was governor of the Plymouth colony for 30-some-odd years, and Winthrop was off and on of Massachusetts Bay, and he was voted out a couple of times, but he always got back in. But you do need to know Bradford, Plymouth, Winthrop, Massachusetts Bay. What were the voting requirements? Mainly that you were of the right religious persuasion for whatever colony you lived in, that you owned some property, and you were a white male. That white male was strictly through all of the colonies. As for the governorship, you've got the governor, who is either elected or appointed. Under him, he has an appointed council. He appoints the council. They're kind of like the senators. They don't have any legal power, but they have a lot of power on the governor. Then you've got an elected assembly of supposedly the common man. And the elected assembly has the power of the purse. They can pass taxes. That's exactly what power of the purse means. You have the power to pass taxes. And sometimes the assembly can get the governor to do something that they want him to do by just withholding his paycheck, because they're the ones that voted the money. Now, this is additional information. We mentioned theocracy, but we didn't mention oligarchy or aristocrat. Now, aristocrat in Europe usually meant that you had not royal blood, but you were like a duke or an earl or a count or something like that. But in this country, in the New World, in Americas, aristocrat just simply meant that you were educated, very much so, and you had money and land. Theocracy simply means that the church is running the government. Oligarchy is what they say the United States is, that the government is run by a few rich people. Now, you need to know the indenture system. That's when you sell your body and soul to the ship captain who gives you passage to the new world for 6, 8, 5, 10, whatever years you're going to get. Then he sells the contract when he gets to the new world, and you have to work for them until your indenture is paid off. The Religious Toleration Act was passed to protect the minority Catholics, because Catholics had set up the colony of Maryland. But it was such a nice place to go, and everybody was healthy, and it was just being so prosperous that a whole bunch of Protestants moved in. And pretty soon there's more Protestants than there are Catholics. So they had to pass an act to protect them. And of course the Mayflower Compact was not a constitution. It was simply an agreement to be self-ruled. You've also, part of this was not mentioned. Now, we did talk about the Great Migration when there was something like thousands, tens of thousands of the Puritans left England for the New World and other places too, but mostly for the New World. They had heard a rumor that King James I was going to eliminate them. So they decided to migrate, and they went to an area called Massachusetts Bay, called the Massachusetts Colony, or Boston. It's going to be in New England. What we didn't mention to you, and I should have, is people lived longer in the New England colonies than they did the Southern colonies. Yes, Jamestown had gotten over, and Virginia gotten over all that dying thing, but they still had a lot of death and dying in the South. Mainly in the North, there was a lot of natural increase. In other words, women were having more babies. There was a very high life expectancy because, well, in the wintertime, it got so cold, it killed off the germs, so we didn't have that many germs. So they lived longer, and they had stronger family ties because they even had living grandparents, which is something that did not happen in the South. In the South, you had mosquitoes, you had malaria, you had snakes, you had all kinds of problems in the South. It was getting better, but it still wasn't as good as it was in New England. So you've got New England, and remember those why you would live longer in New England. That being said, I think you need to know all of these, especially the different types of the colonies, not the location of the colonies, but the different types, like the joint stock and proprietorship, corporate and royal. These are types of colonies, not locations. So locations would be New England, Middle, and the Southern, of course. Good luck.